Bleeding Kansas. John Brown and his sons, they take over. They attack these slavery settlers near Pottawatomie Creek, and they don't just kill them, they take them captive and hack them to death and shoot them in the head, because it's what you do. Now, you could argue that, they had it coming, but realistically, these particular people had nothing to do with the events of Lawrence, Kansas. So yes, they are enslavers, but none of them, or they're not even enslavers, they're pro-slavery. So morally, you have to question that. But ethically, there are no enslaved people with them. They had nothing to do with the events in Lawrence, and John Brown and his sons attack and kill them all. And this is really where John Brown gets the reputation of being a madman. But what this does is set off a wave of violence and guerrilla warfare throughout Kansas. And this is why Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, because clashes are going to escalate throughout Kansas over the years up until the Civil War, where we see over 150 deaths before the war. And there's also significant property loss because people are burning things down. Again, this amount of violence gives Kansas the nickname Bleeding Kansas, and it is going to force a split between pacifist abolitionists and violent abolitionists, which we'll talk about later when we talk about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. But the violence of the anti-slavery, pro-slavery contingent is not limited to citizens and territorial disputes. It is taking place in Congress. Charles Sumner gives a speech in Congress called Crime Against Kansas. And Charles Sumner is a Northern senator from Massachusetts. He is anti-slavery. I believe he's pro-abolition, although I would definitely have to double check that. I know he's anti-slavery. I cannot say for sure that he's pro-abolition, but I think he is. His speech about the crimes against Kansas enraged Senator Preston Brooks so much that he attacks Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. Now, Preston Brooks is a Southern gentleman. It's what he does. He's a gentleman, right? Brooks believes that Sumner has gone too far because Sumner called out his uncle, who also happens to be a senator from South Carolina, because Charles Sumner compares slavery to prostitution and declares, this is a direct quote, "Of course he, Butler, which is his uncle, has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him, though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery." Preston Brooks takes great offense to this because how dare you insult my family's name? And everybody knows that the Southern Code of Honor is that you defend your family name. And so Brooks has to defend his family name, which apparently means that you attack a man who's giving a speech with a cane and almost cane him to death. We're not talking like a nice little walking cane. Canes in the 1850s were aggressive weapons, and the appropriate way to defend your family's honor is to challenge the dishonored person to a duel. So you challenge the person who dishonored your family name to a duel. You don't attack them with a cane. Brooks beats Sumner so badly on the Congress floor that Sumner is left mentally and physically incapacitated for a very long time. He is reelected, but his seat sits empty for a very long time as a reminder to the rest of the Senate of what had happened. And Brooks, on the other side, gets lots of cheering and support from the Southerners, and a lot of people actually send him canes to replace the one that he broke when he was caning Sumner to death. And then we move on to the case of Dred-Scott and the unfortunate situation which leads us to, again, probably the last step before Civil War. So Kansas is bleeding out. President Buchanan is not able to stop it. Sumner's beat on the floor. Things are a mess. And while all of this is happening, in 1857, the Supreme Court decides they are finally going to give the ruling of the case that has been brought before them, the Dred-Scott case. And what this case involves is an enslaved man, Dred-Scott, who was born enslaved in Virginia in 1795. He is forced to relocate with his owner. He is taken to Missouri. In 1820, he is then taken to Illinois and into Wisconsin Territory. But Illinois and Wisconsin territories are free territories under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So in 1820, when he's taken there, he decides that means he's been given his freedom. And so when Scott is forced to return to Missouri, he attempts to take his freedom but is refused. And so he takes his case to court saying that because he lived in the areas where slavery was banned, he should be free. And so the case goes in front of a jury, and the jury finds Scott and his family to be free. But then Scott's enslaver appeals the finding, and the state superior court reverses the decision, which returns Scott to John Sanford, who lives in New York, not Missouri. But now, because the issue is between Missouri and New York rather than one state, the issue falls into a federal court jurisdiction where Scott loses. So when he appeals, he gets to appeal it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decides the case under Justice Roger Taney, who is a former enslaver himself. He had released those he enslaved, but he was still an enslaver. And he reads the final decision that says Scott would remain enslaved and following this ruling, no Black person could be a citizen of the United States. Furthermore, that Congress had no authority to stop or limit the spread of slavery in the American territories, and therefore, not only was the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, but so too is Douglas's popular sovereignty. So essentially, he's saying the states can decide what they want to do, and it's not up to the federal government to interfere with the institution of slavery in terms of stopping or limiting it. But it is up to us to determine if a Black person can be a citizen or not. And again, this continues to back the Southern slave power conspiracy theory that the South is controlling the government, including the Supreme Court, and these sectional differences are going to be, they're never going to end. It's going to be a problem until they can solve it through probable violence. And so the Dred-Scott ruling from 1857 essentially ends these years of legal battles about slavery. And this becomes the basis for why we need the 14th Amendment after the end of the war. Because in 1857, Justice Taney says, Black people are not citizens. So once the war is over, we have to make sure that citizenship and what it means belong to everybody in the United States, which is why we have the 14th Amendment today. It is to override the Dred-Scott ruling. And we will see this Dred-Scott ruling upheld until the end of the Civil War and until Reconstruction. And then once Reconstruction ends, we will just see other ways to oppress people who are not white. But for now, that brings us to life in the South and lead up to the Civil War.